The story of North America begins with its waterways. From the fishing waters off the East Coast to the vast inland seas known as the Great Lakes, magnificent ships of sail and steam have charted the course of our nation's history, but not without a tragic cost. More than 240,000 square kilometers in size, the Great Lakes make up the largest inland body of fresh water on the planet. Friday, November 7th, 1913. The Great Lakes have never been busier.
Probably the best way to think about the Great Lakes in 1913 is to think of it as the 401 of the day. For the movement of people, it was a very important transportation route. Also for the movement of goods.
On this particular Friday, on the northern shores of Lake Superior, Captain William Wright supervises the loading of the James C. Carruthers, the newest and largest freighter on the lake.
The Carruthers had been launched that same year, and the Carruthers was a big vessel. It was 529 feet long, and it was a steel ship.
The Wexford is everything the big freighter is not: older, smaller, and slower.
She was a salty or an ocean design, so she was peculiar in that she wasn't typical of what you'd see on Lake Huron. She was one of those vessels that was at the crossing point between sail and steam.
Wexford Captain Bruce Cameron is watching the skies. He is experienced enough to know that the witch of November is at hand.
November is one of the most volatile months because you still have the warm southerly tropical moisture coming in from the Gulf of Mexico. And usually in mid-late October, you start to see some really good surges of polar air into the Great Lakes. And what happens is that you get this clash of the atmosphere and the air masses, and you can develop some strong storms, especially with the wind.
For captains and crews across the Great Lakes, there is only time for one or two more deliveries.
They worked very, very hard during the actual shipping season, especially towards the end of the season. The pressure was on by the first and second week of November to get those last trips in to get that profit margin up.
In Sarnia, on the southern shores of Lake Huron, a small Canadian freighter, the Regina, is being loaded. This is Captain Ed McConkey's first season as the ship's skipper. He's eager to squeeze in one more trip, despite storm signals hoisted in the harbor. Like most shipmasters, McConkey is suspicious of any warning issued by the Weather Bureau.
Weather prediction at the time in 1913 was pretty much on a mode where they looked at surface observations and had contact with the different offices upwind from them. It was all very antiquated and very limited.
It was said that shipping lines hired men who would use the barometer only as a coat hook. You know, they said hang their coat over the barometer or the hat over the barometer. These were men who were used to ignoring weather warnings.
One man who cannot ignore the warnings is Milton Smith, assistant engineer on the Charles S. Price. The Price is the pride of the Great Lakes, and few crew members voluntarily leave before season's end. But something tells Milton Smith that he must do just that, and it has to be today. His chief engineer, John Groundwater, cannot believe that Smith is willing to give up his end-of-season bonus for a vague premonition, but cannot change the crewman's mind. Friday afternoon, November 7th, 1913. The configuration of red and white lanterns at weather posts indicate gale force winds of 112 kilometers per hour or more. Several ships have already left port.
In 1913, we had no hurricane warning on the Great Lakes, and because it was believed that we would not have a hurricane force storm.
Ships already on Lake Superior are hit by the first punch of the storm. The largest of the Great Lakes becomes a giant cauldron of writhing water and yowling winds. The L.C. Waldo leaves port 2 hours before storm warnings are raised. Now, an angry sea is trying to tear it apart. Pounding waves smash into the deckhouse at the bow of the ship, which encloses the captain's bridge and wheelhouse. It shatters windows, tears away the roof, and destroys the ship compass and steering system. To cross the long, low deck of the Waldo during a storm is madness. Captain John Duddleson and his wheelsman have no choice.
And the captain and the wheelsman went to the emergency steering platform in the stern of the ship, and they tied themselves there. And the captain had a hand compass and a lantern, and the wheelsman steered and the captain called the course throughout the storm.
Throughout Saturday morning, November 8th, the storm grows steadily worse. Saturday afternoon, the winds suddenly change direction.
Basically, the Arctic air was being pulled in all the way to the east coast, and then what happened is it just pulled it right back toward the Great Lakes and the eastern Great Lakes, and then you have that cyclonic flow going on, and as you imagine, like a spinning top.
With the change in the wind comes a rapid drop in temperature. Ice builds up on battered masts and wheelhouses as the storm-stricken ships try to find shelter.
They didn't know how much they were drifting to port or to starboard as a result of the wind that was blowing on the side of the ship. The visibility would drop to the point where you couldn't even see the bow of the ship.
Sunday, November 9th, 1913. On Superior's south shore, the Henry B. Smith, one of the largest freighters on the lakes, is anxious to complete one last trip. Less than 30 kilometers out of port, the Smith and its crew of 25 are swallowed whole by the seething waters of Lake Superior.
Ships were trying to meet their economic deadlines towards the end of the shipping season. The timing couldn't have been worse, and with this huge change in weather, they got caught.
It is only by sheer chance that other ships have escaped the clutches of the Lake Superior storm. Both the James C. Carruthers and the Wexford find shelter near Sault Ste. Marie. Although warnings are still posted, Captain Bruce Cameron and the other shipmasters feel that the worst is over.
The local interpretation of what was happening was that things were getting better and the winds were dropping, the barometer was rising, so Bruce Cameron set out with the Wexford, as did a number of other vessels.
Many of those vessels are at the other end of Lake Huron, including the Regina and the Charles S. Price. As the Price makes its way upriver towards Lake Huron, second mate Howard Mackley blows the ship whistle for his wife Evelyn on shore. It is a tradition they have shared since their wedding 17 months earlier. Not far behind is skipper Ed McConkey and his Canadian package freighter, the Regina. As the day continues, weather systems over Lake Superior move south. The storm grows in strength.
It not only deepened tremendously, it slowed up. Boy, that's why you had such strong winds on the lakes for so long. I mean, you're looking at 16 hours of 60 to 70 mile-an-hour winds.
On the east coast of Lake Huron, the James C. Carruthers heads for the shelter of Georgian Bay. Captain William Wright orders his wheelsman to make the critical turn that will put them on course into the bay. Not far away, the Regina is also heading north. But Captain Ed McConkey is concerned, and he decides to turn back toward Sarnia.
I think that my father was not an extremely excitable man. He loved it. He loved the ship, and he loved his crew. So I think that he'd feel that he could handle it.
In making a turn in heavy seas, there is the danger of getting caught in the valley that forms between the waves. Now, with the winds and waves moving in different directions, the ship stays broadside, helplessly drifting in the rolling trough. Captain Ed McConkey tells his crew to prepare for the worst.
You have 30-foot seas in those lakes, and you're fighting for your own life to try and keep your vessel afloat.
At home, Captain McConkey's wife and family wait for word that the Regina is safely into port.
My mother said that she was not worried. She knew that there was a very bad storm. She felt confident that she would get a telephone call from him saying that he was okay. And they waited and waited for the long-distance call, and it never came.
Meanwhile, along the Canadian coast of Lower Lake Huron, Captain Bruce Cameron guides the Wexford south through icy seas.
The Wexford was apparently trying to make Goderich Harbor, but Goderich Harbor is a very difficult harbor to get into if there's any sea running.
There were several reports about whistles being blown from the Wexford. That night, there were residents in the town of Goderich and employees along the waterfront who reported hearing bells and whistles again, or seeing lights even, which would indicate that she was still there, still waiting to have the storm abate and make port.
The storm does not abate for another 24 hours, long after distress signals from the Wexford fade into the night. Monday, November 10th, 1913. The station captain at Port Huron spots the hull of a ship on the horizon. It is a lake freighter floating bottom side up, its name and identity shrouded by murky water. It is dubbed the Mystery Ship, a riddle to be solved in the aftermath of the Great Storm. Tuesday, November 11th, 1913. A farmer walking along the Canadian shoreline of Lake Huron sees something in the water. It is the body of a young sailor from the Wexford, frozen in the icy waters. It is the first body that washes ashore. His shipmates soon follow, along with debris from the small steamer.
There's a documented report of a life jacket hanging in a tree on top of the bank from a site near Bayfield. And from that point south, we have bodies and other material from the Wexford, including one of the lifeboats.
10 days after the storm, a piece of wood washes ashore near Goderich. On it is a brief, tragic message.
I am with the boat, lashed to the wheel.
It is signed simply B by Wexford Captain Bruce Cameron. The young skipper's body is never found. In the grim week that follows, bodies continue to wash up on Great Lakes shorelines. The body of Emily Walker, a cook on the steamer Argus, is found wearing a life jacket with the word Captain stenciled on it. When the body of the Argus skipper washes ashore, it is without a life preserver.
The amount of wreckage that had come ashore was incredible. These ships were carrying lumber, they were carrying whiskey, they were carrying any household good you could think of. And all of this material was coming ashore in great piles.
As more wreckage drifts in, it brings with it the unthinkable, that the grandest ship on the Great Lakes has gone down.
It's difficult to say what happened to the Carruthers because this was a brand new ship. She may have grounded out and poked a hole in her bottom that nobody noticed until it was too late.
Soon after, a body is found with a familiar beard and a ring with the initials WW. It is the Carruthers captain, William Wright. North of Sarnia, 2 bodies come ashore in a lifeboat from the Regina. 11 more bodies are found close by. Some are identified as crewmen from the Regina, but others are from the Charles S. Price, the first evidence that this freighter has been lost as well. All the bodies are taken by wagons to makeshift morgues in nearby towns.
In the morning, two of my uncles boarded the train and went to Godrich, where many of the bodies had been washed up. They went to see if they could find my father's body, but they returned home that they had not found it.
Many more arrive in Godrich with the sad task of identifying loved ones. Evelyn Mackley comes looking for her husband, Howard, second mate on the Charles S. Price. She never finds him. A week later, she receives a love letter from her husband, mailed just before his last trip. Milton Smith, the assistant engineer whose intuition told him to leave the Price, is asked to identify dead shipmates. He recognizes his old chief engineer, John Groundwater.
And the coroner looked at him and said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Sure, I worked with this guy, I know this man, and, this is John Groundwater." I said, "Well, can you tell us why I was wearing a Regina life jacket?" A number of bodies came ashore with Regina life jackets on them, although they were from the Charles S. Price.
Some speculate that the Price and the Regina collided in the storm, and that life preservers were exchanged in the confusion. That theory is discarded on November 15th, when a diver identifies the mystery ship still floating upside down in Lake Huron. It is the Charles S. Price. There is no evidence of a collision, and no sign of the Regina close by. Some wonder if the Regina didn't come upon the Price in trouble and try to help.
It's not impossible that the Regina saw the Charles Price go over, saw the men in the water, steamed as close as they dared, and threw life jackets to them for them to get into a lifeboat and attempt to rescue. That is really a remarkable act of courage. If it did indeed happen. We'll never know if it happened.
Funerals and memorial services are held in towns and villages along the Lake Huron coast. Many communities are devastated by the loss of so many of their own.
The brothers and uncles and sons and cousins, it must have created a very grievous moment. Although this storm was of enormous proportions and bigger than anything that had been experienced before, death and tragedy on the lakes was not uncommon. But in this particular circumstance, with so many lost, the pain must have been enormous.
It is almost a year before the McConkey family is able to lay the skipper of the Regina to rest.
The following summer, his body was washed up on the shores of Michigan. He was still wearing his fur-lined coat, and in his pockets he had several things that he had treasured. One of them was his diary and his gold watch. And my sister Amy writes about that occasion, and she describes my mother standing at the top of the hill waiting for the wagon or hearse. It would be a hearse. She described my mother as looking happy. She said, I wondered why she could be smiling. But she said, your father's coming home, Amy.
In terms of ships and crews lost, the storm of 1913 is the worst in Great Lakes history. 12 ships are at the bottom of the lakes, and up to 40 more in need of repair. The exact number of dead will never be known. Ship owners and skippers blame inadequate forecasts and storm warnings, while the weather bureaus maintain that posted storm signals were ignored by ship captains.
All these guys went sailing out into this thing thinking it's just going to be a standard November blow, and it took 19 ships, 250 plus lives.
An inquest leads to recommendations for improvements in the future.
I think it cleaned up the way weather reports were communicated to sailors. I think it did lead to some improvements in lights and lighthouses along the lakes generally.
For years, the location of many of the lost ships remains a mystery. One riddle is finally solved in 1986 by a diver who finds his gear snagged on an anchor chain.
The diver followed the anchor chain back to a ship, and the ship was lying on its side, and that was the SS Regina. And she was lying within a mile of the shore.
In 2000, a fisherman using an electronic fish finder locates the biggest catch of all, the wreck of the Wexford, upright and perfectly preserved 120 kilometers off Huron's south shore.
The way she sits today, she has no rudder, and she has a large chunk out of one propeller blade, so that would tell me that somewhere along the line she either struck bottom or through a combination of the wave action and rolling, her rudder was thrown out of the shoe and broken off, and she lost steerage.
It changed the face of shipping on the Great Lakes. The lakes now had the respect of people who, prior to that, thought, well, these are only mud puddles. When in reality, I've known men who've gone around Cape Horn and say sailing in Georgian Bay is sometimes worse.
The Great Storm is one of the worst tragedies in Canada's maritime history. But in just a few months, disaster will strike again, this time on the icy coast of Newfoundland. More lives will be lost, and again, nature and human greed will be the cause. March 13th, 1914. The Great Lakes tragedy is just a few months old, but it is far from the minds of those manning the fleet of ships leaving St. John's Harbor on the southeastern coast of Newfoundland. For over 100 years, men and ships have been leaving this harbor in early spring, headed for the ice patches of northern Newfoundland and southern Labrador. Another sealing season is about to begin. In the lead is the SS Stefano, the largest and grandest ship of the fleet.
It was something over 2,000 tons and used as a passenger steamer to Halifax and New York and so on. But during the sealing season, they would board over the decks and it would be sent out to the ice.
At the helm is the legendary Abram Keane, the greatest sealing captain of them all.
He was a very rigid, very puritanical old man who was enormously successful at the work he was doing, which was killing and bringing in seals. The men were all afraid of him, with almost no exceptions, and these included the officers on the ships.
Abram is not the only Keane leaving St. John's that day. His oldest son, Joseph, is captain of the Florizel, the second largest steamer in the convoy. The Florizel was the first sealer to use wireless telegraphy 5 years earlier. In 1914, all the ships leaving the harbor are outfitted with this new technology. All except one. The SS Newfoundland is the largest of the wooden walls and the oldest.
The Newfoundland was an old wooden steamer, 40-odd years old, and slow. She didn't have the power to force her way through the ice fields the way the Stefano and the Florizel did.
The master of this particular wooden wall has the added pressure of being the son of the legendary Abram Keane. Westbury Keane is just starting his 4th season as ship captain.
Westbury was one of his youngest sons, was probably the least experienced of the Kane's family.
21 ships and 3,700 men leave port. Some of those men have just over 2 weeks to live. Tuesday, March 31st, 1914. A group of ships from the sealing fleet are working the ice patches 72 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland.
The ice field drifted south from the area between Greenland and northern Canada. Some years the ice pans were very dense, and other years they were very scattered. But the seals always had their young on the ice.
The morning is warm and calm, and men from the Stefano and the Florizel are on the ice already, harvesting newborn seals known as whitecoats. Two more ironclads, the Bellaventure and the Bonaventure, are a few kilometers away, pushing their way through the heavy ice. The only ship not moving is the SS Newfoundland. The wooden wall has been jammed in the ice for over a week now, its crew only able to bring in 400 pelts since the season began. Even a young sealman like Cecil Moland can see the effect this has on his captain, Westbury Keane.
They used to climb the rigging 2 and 3 times a day with a spike lace up in the barrel, they called, on the masthead. And they used to scan the old ocean, and they see a steamer. You think, you're not sure, they may be killing seals there. And all he wanted was to get into a patch of seals. He wanted to make a name for himself like his father.
It is his father who offers a solution.
Captain Abram Kane had told Westbury that if he found the seals, he would raise the after derrick. And if Westbury saw this, he would know that the seals were in the presence of the Stefano. So by March the 30th, with the season coming to an end, he saw the derrick being raised on the Stefano.
The lack of a wireless makes it impossible for Westbury Keane to communicate directly with his father or the other ships. He orders his men to walk the 10 kilometers to the Stefano and get directions to the sighted seal herds. He puts George Tuff in charge.
George Tuff was second hand on the Newfoundland. He was an extremely experienced, very experienced sealer. He'd been to the ice many times. He had a great record of getting seals.
George Tuff and his crew of 160 men make their way across the ice patch towards the SS Stefano. The weather is still mild, and many of the men have exchanged their heavier outerwear for lighter clothing.
They wore whatever they had. They had heavy mitts and they had sweaters on under jackets and some things of this sort, but they weren't what you would call dressed for Arctic conditions.
As they move across the ice, several of the crew notice a bank of thick clouds forming to the north. The weather continues to thicken. Around 10, some of the men decide to return to the Newfoundland.
They sensed that there was a storm coming, and about 132 in all continued on.
After a 4.5-hour trek, George Tuff and his crew finally reach the Stefano. Many of the Newfoundland crew assume they are staying aboard that night, but Captain Abram Keane has other plans. He tells George Tuff that he is taking them to a herd of 1,500 seals on a patch 3 kilometers closer to the Newfoundland. This way, Tuff and his crew can return to their ship when their work is done.
George Tuff would never have believed that Captain Kane could do anything stupid or anything wrong. This man, Captain Abram Kane, was regarded as just a little bit below God. So Tuff would have assumed that the old man was doing the right thing.
Cecil Moland and the Newfoundland crew have barely finished their hard bread and tea before Captain Keane orders them off his ship.
When we got our cup of tea, he was hollering, over the side. He kept on saying that. Some fellas got kind of afraid of him or something, and they went down in a hurry. So he put us out and told us to go on and pan seals and then walk to our own ship. And we was about 6 or 7 miles from the Newfoundland, and that's a long walk.
Captain Abram Kane must have known that there was threatening weather when he put the men on the ice, but he believed they were close enough to the ship to get back to it.
It is almost 12 noon. As the Stefano steams away, George Tuff directs his men to a patch of seals several kilometers away. Sealer Jacob Dalton and the rest of the Newfoundland crew can barely see their own ship in the distance.
I've heard him say that he knew then that there was something going to happen there, right? They'd never make it back, because as he kept on going, the weather got worse. And then the wind started to pick up, and then they couldn't see where they were walking. A real blizzard.
George Tuff was a very experienced second hand, but he seems to have been unwilling to challenge authority or challenge orders. He had been told by Abram Kane to kill the seals before returning to the ship. He looked upon that as an order that could not be disobeyed.
In less than a half hour, the weather is so bad that they decide to forget the seals and head for their ship.
Had they stopped where there were seals they had killed that morning, they could have built a reasonable shelter, and they would have had the seal pelts to burn, and they'd had the seal meat to eat. But of course they headed for the Newfoundland, even though they knew they were at least 4 hours away from it.
4 hours away, the 34 men who turned back earlier that morning arrive at the Newfoundland. When some express concerns to Captain Westbury Keene that the rest of the crew is caught somewhere between the Stefano and their own ship, he assures them that he has seen the men board the Stefano and that his father will look after them. Meanwhile, there is concern among the Stefano crew that men from the Newfoundland might not have reached their ship.
Well, my uncle Sam Horwood tried to make Kane go look for the party when he realized that they weren't aboard the Stefano and that they might be on the ice. Kane was quite stubborn and quite determined that he was the boss. He was going to do what he felt was right, and he wasn't going to take any orders from Sam Horwood or anybody else.
On board the Newfoundland, Westbury was convinced that his men were on board the Stefano, and on board the Stefano, Abram Kane, he assumed that the men had made it back to the Newfoundland, but they had no way of contacting each other.
Meanwhile, they were all out freezing to death.
Tuesday, March 31st, 1914. The island of Newfoundland is at the mercy of the worst storm of the winter. The storm breaks so viciously that it blows open the doors at the home of schoolteacher Jessie Collins. She can only hope that her sweetheart, Cecil Moland, a sealer working on the SS Newfoundland, is safe. 72 kilometers off the island's northeast coast, the spring sailing fleet is battling the same storm. Captain Westbury Keene of the SS Newfoundland assumes that his crew of 130 men are safe aboard his father's ship, the SS Stefano. He assumes wrong. The men are several kilometers away, trying to follow their own path back to the ship, led by second-hand George Tuff.
He used to say, keep on going and keep the wind in the side of your face. But the wind was gradually changing up. And then after dark, we was going around in circles. We didn't know where we were going because the wind was changing all the time.
With the darkness, the men have no choice but to find shelter.
The type of shelter they could build was very limited. The best they could hope to do was to build a wall. It wasn't much protection because with the rain it didn't help at all.
By midnight, with temperatures falling fast, none of the shelters can protect them from the wind either.
The major protection really came from the men themselves who had the strength to keep going and to stay alive.
Cecil Moland uses the image of sweetheart Jessie Collins to help keep him going. Ironically, the leader of his group is also named Jessie Collins, a veteran who encourages his men to use exercise to battle the cold.
Jessie Collins tried to get men to pretend that they were walking in a circle and pounding each other on the back, and that to try to keep circulation going.
Wednesday morning, April 1st. Winds are so powerful that the men fear being blown off the ice. To make matters worse, some of their shipmates have not survived the night. Some lie dead and frozen on the ice pans where they fell. On the SS Newfoundland, Captain Westbury Keene still believes his men are on the Stefano. When the weather clears at noon, he steams towards his father's ship before getting jammed in the ice 2.5 kilometers away. Not far away, crews from the Bonaventure are panning seals on the ice floes. Second-hand Abram Parsons sees the men in the distance and assumes that they too are working the ice fields.
During the second day on the ice, some of the ships were visible but distant. The other ships were not close enough to see a party of men on the ice, but they were close enough so the party of men could at least see the sealing ship.
Some of the men are already on their way toward it. But just when the Bonaventure appears to be steaming towards them, it suddenly veers away in the opposite direction. Second-hand George Tuff catches sight of the Stefano and tells the men that Captain Keane is finally coming for them. He watches until the Stefano also turns away. There is one ship left, their own, jammed in the ice about 3 kilometers away. Night is falling as Tuff and a few men head toward it.
They could see the Newfoundland, and as some of them walked towards the Newfoundland broke free and steamed away from them.
As another freezing night sets in, those who lived through Tuesday's storm begin to surrender themselves to exhaustion, desperation, and the bitter cold, despite attempts by veteran sealer Jacob Dalton to keep members of his group alive.
You just go and pick them up and shake them and keep talking to them, oh, you're all going to be okay. And he had a strong nerve and a strong will to live. He kept a nice few people alive, talking to them by, getting them up.
In his group, Cecil Moland can only watch as friends and shipmates die around him.
And some fellas that didn't want to die, they really died hard, and they fought till the very last minute.
Sealer James Donovan is so used to seeing men die around him that when his own brother Stephen finally succumbs, he is unaffected, pausing only long enough to take his brother's cap for his own. Those still able to comprehend what is happening try to hold on to anything that will pull them through. For Cecil Moland, it is the New Testament given to him by sweetheart Jessie Collins and the burning need to see her again.
She loved me so much, she gave me that before I went to the seal fishery in 1914, and said, keep it in your vest pocket always, and I put it in my vest pocket.
Thursday, April 2nd, 1914. The morning is cold, frosty, and clear. Captain Westbury Keane finds a break in the ice and steams the SS Newfoundland towards the Stefano, intending to pick up his crew.
Westbury Keane was up in the crow's nest and moving his spyglass idly around, he saw a couple of men staggering towards his ship.
One of the men is his second hand, George Tuff, snowblind and barely alive. 9 more follow in the distance. Westbury Keane immediately puts up a distress signal. Captain Abram Keane sends 2 men aboard the Newfoundland and discovers for the first time that the crew he let off on Tuesday did not reach their ship. The Stefano makes its way through the heavy ice in search of survivors. It is said that Keane stops to pick up seal pelts along the way.
He was picking up men, pulling men on his ship on one side and pulling seals in on the other.
At the same time, spotters on the SS Bonaventure report a party of men approaching their ship. Once on board, the men report more than 50 dead where they were earlier that morning. The Bonaventure immediately sends out a search party with food and supplies.
And what they found was horrifying because the frozen men, in some cases were clinging together.
Some of them froze onto the ice and they couldn't get them. They had to bring them a trunk of ice and all on stretchers when they finally got around to rescuing these people.
Word quickly spreads to all ships in the sealing fleet that 70 dead men have been pulled from the ice. 8 more are missing and are never recovered. All the bodies are put on board the Bonaventure, which steams for St. John's Harbor. Crews on many of the other ships feel they should follow, abandoning the seal hunt out of respect for the dead. Saturday, April 4th, 1914. The SS Bonaventure enters St. John's Harbor, its flag at half-mast.
There were thousands of people from St. John's down on the waterfront to see this happen. And there was nothing but dead silence when they started bringing the bodies and the living ashore. And there was no feeling of outrage until later when they discovered who had been involved in causing the disaster.
Many feel that Captain Abram Keene is responsible, that he never should have let the men off with a storm brewing. In a letter to a local newspaper, Captain Keene offers no apology or acceptance of guilt, saying that anyone who goes sealing must accept the risks that go with it. For Captain Westbury Keene, the true cause of the tragedy is clear: the lack of a wireless aboard the Newfoundland.
The one responsible for the men once they got to the Stefano, of course, was Captain Abram Keene, not Westbury. He was the one who abandoned them on the ice, believing they could walk back to their own ship.
Despite letters and petitions demanding Abram Keene's dismissal and arrest, a sealing commission inquiry cannot agree on the cause of the tragedy, finally calling it an act of God. Many sealers, including Jacob Dalton, will blame Keene for the rest of their lives.
I've heard them say lots of times that it was his fault, and he got it scotch-free. He got away with it.
The season of 1914 is the worst in Newfoundland sealing history. 78 men die on the ice patch.
Some of the survivors lost both feet, so that there were quite a number of people who were disabled for life, in addition to the ones who were actually killed by the frost. Many of them never went back to sealing again.
After this happened this year, he still went to the seal fishery. The next year he was back at it again. Oh yeah, he won't give up. But that was enough there to see all them people die. To just, forget that. I ain't going back at it now, but he just kept at it.
One of those who does not return to sealing is Cecil Moland.
Cecil Moland not only survived, he went home and he married Jessie, his sweetheart, the one he was determined to live to marry, and was still living with her 50 years later. I think the long-term effects of the disaster would have been that sealing was no longer regarded as a responsibility for the individual sealer. It became much more the responsibility of the government and the responsibility of the captain, so that the seal hunt became a much less haphazard affair than it was. They immediately began putting wireless aboard all ships, for instance. They realized that had there been wireless aboard the Newfoundland, it wouldn't have happened.
Along the Great Lakes, the gales of November continue to blow, and from time to time, ships are still lost. 5 ships lost in the Great Storm of 1913 have yet to be found, but those who sailed them are still remembered on both the Canadian and American side of the lakes. There is no memorial for the sealers lost on the ice in March of 1914, save for the reminiscences of shipmates and families left behind. The survivors are all gone now, just a memory themselves. Cecil Moland died in 1978, but he, like those trapped on the ice with him, lived with the experience for the rest of his life.
I'm surprised sometimes. I look at myself. I look at myself and I talk to myself in the mirror, because how did you ever manage to come through that terrible Newfoundland disaster?